Welcome. Today we're going to do a book that my copy is falling apart so much I can barely even show you the cover. This is partially because I've read it so much, but also because I bought an older copy. It's called Toward a Psychology of Being by Abraham Maslow. And it started falling apart, so we had it spiral bound, and now the pages are all coming out, but of course it's all marked up, and I don't want to lose my markings, so I haven't bought a new copy. But that just shows you it's really a great read. This is one of Maslow's most important books, maybe his most important book. It was from an article that he wrote earlier that his hierarchy of needs was created. But in this book, he talks about, he makes it really clear. He says, I want to open a discussion of these things, and I hope that other people will join the conversation, and that they'll bring more to the table, and that they'll investigate the things I've investigated and try to discover whether or not they're true. I'm trying to find this really interesting thing here in the introduction, which is in the newer versions is chapter 1, but in this older version it's the introduction, Toward a Psychology of Health. He says some really interesting things about what he's doing and why he's doing it. But one thing that he does say is, this point of view in no way denies the usual Freudian picture, but it does add to it and supplement it, to oversimplify the matter somewhat. It is as if Freud supplied to us the sick half of psychology, and we must now fill it out with the healthy half. So, with Freud and William James, we begin to have what has become modern psychology. And Maslow is a really important voice in modern psychology, and it's precisely for this reason. I think he's summed it up beautifully in that one sentence that Freud spent his career studying very unhealthy people, and Maslow said, that's fine, that's good, that's important information to have, but now let's find out how that contrasts with the healthiest people, the best people, the most, what he eventually came to call the self-actualized people. And let's contrast that and find out how we can get healthier. Not just how we can avoid neuroses and illness, but how can we become more like the truly helpful self-actualized people? What do they like? How do they spend their time? What is the value system that they live by? What things do they, how do they think? How do they act? Those were all the questions that Maslow wanted to answer, and he took that that quest, that self-appointed mission, very seriously and spent his life studying those things. He died kind of young. Seems like he was in his 50s or something. But not until he had kind of laid a foundation for what this other half of psychology, filling in this other half of psychology, was going to look like. This book presents the picture. It's after years and years of study and research and analyzation and interviewing hundreds of individuals that he called self-actualized, and then trying to put all the information that he discovered in one place and present it, especially to the psychological world. It's not a mainstream read, even in a psychology class in college, or even you might read some of his original stuff in a master's program. You might read a little bit of Maslow himself. You might probably not want to read this whole book. I'm going to tell you, I think the most important chapters for that I enjoyed the most, that I think everybody should read, is the introduction, or chapter 1, called Toward a Psychology of Health. And then chapter 4, Defense and Growth, is very interesting. Chapter 5 is even more valuable, I think. It's called The Need to Know and the Fear of Knowing. And of course I'm really interested in that subject because I'm all about education and learning. And so in that chapter he talks about how we have this love-hate relationship with knowledge, with gaining knowledge, that we need to know, because that's the way that we grow. We grow by learning, and so we need to learn, but we avoid knowledge of things because then it creates greater responsibility. It places greater responsibility on our shoulders, and that's something that we want to avoid. And so we need to know, and we fear knowing. There's also chapter 10, creativity and self-actualizing people. And the reason I love that chapter is because there's another chapter called Cognition of Being in the Peak Experiences. So in that chapter, that's chapter 6. In that chapter, he talks about that self-actualized people are self-actualized because he has something he calls peak experiences more often than most people. And he takes and self-actualized people take those peak experiences very seriously, and they act on them. And so he analyzes what are those peak experiences like, and he also analyzes what self-actualized people are like. And the creativity in self-actualizing people is very valuable. I've had students read it, and they've come to understand creativity in new ways because of these chapters I'm recommending. But one of the things that I love about this chapter 10, he talks about, chapter 10 is really good, and then chapter 11 is really good. In chapter 10, he begins to introduce this idea of what creativity is, and he says some interesting things. Some, of course, obviously, most of which I agree with. It's very scientifically sound for the most part. Sometimes you'll find something you disagree with. But at the beginning of chapter 11, Maslow really, he makes himself known to us in the introduction in chapter 1, but he reiterates it again in chapter 11 of kind of who he is and what he's about, and it's important to know. Now, on this blog, I'm going to recommend books to you under the category of worldviews that you can see in your drop-down menu of genres, because I feel that worldviews is one of the most important things that the average person can learn about. It's something we don't usually learn about, but it's very important information to have because it helps us understand other people in the world and the way that they live and the cultural differences between us and them, but all the ways that we are like them, all the ways that we're similar to other people. And part of that worldviews, one worldview that is part of that study or reading program in worldviews is called humanism. Now, there's videos on that explaining, and introducing worldviews, giving a lot of really good readings on worldviews. So I won't go into that, but it's important that you know that Maslow is a humanist. Now, if you found this blog and you like it because we talk about truth and principles and absolutes, that's wonderful. Some of you may be of a Christian worldview or just a God-based worldview. This is kind of a generic, maybe a Jewish background. Maslow is a humanist. That means, in modern secular humanist terms, that he does not believe in God. And yet, one of the things he says in his introduction, and I've quoted him many places with this quote, he says that as he searches out what is healthy and what is not healthy in human beings, he says, I'm not sure where it is, but he says that the psychologist who engages on this quest has a responsibility to the truth. He says we have to seek out all the truths and integrate them into one truth, which should be our only loyalty. So he puts himself forward, as many people do, as a truth seeker. And I think that he's a good man who really did seek the truth. He actually was raised Jewish and had a really bad experience. I think it was mostly a parenting issue. He had a really bad relationship with his mom, really didn't respect his mom. So he kind of rejected that. But then he turns around and he says, but let's study the good, let's study the right, let's study the whole. And his description in chapter 1 of human nature is much like a dualistic Christian worldview. It's much like, to me, there's a soul and there's a body, and they interact together. It's really interesting. He doesn't say it that way, but that's basically, to me, what he's saying. Then he goes on, and the conclusions that he draws are conclusions about absolutes. Many of the things that he says are like, one of his conclusions, which I'll talk about in a second in chapter 11, is that self-actualized individuals value the same things, and they do many of the same behaviors. One of the quotes I love from him is that he says that when self-actualized people know what is right to do, they do it. They're disciplined, and they seek the right, and they know intuitively what the right and good things are to do, and they do good and right things. So I love that. Anyway, so at the beginning of chapter 11, he talks about his humanism. Humanists for thousands of years have attempted to construct a naturalistic psychological value system that could be derived from man's own nature without the necessity of recourse to authority outside the human being himself. So we want a value system that helps make human beings as healthy as possible, and we don't want to have to reference God or a supreme being or, life after death and things like that. And he feels that he's onto something. He feels like he's onto that because as he's analyzed these self-actualized people, he's found that they have all these things in common. They have a similar common value system. He goes on to say that it's failed. There's still a lot of scoundrels and neurotics in the world, but he says, and of course, many of us feel this way when we're onto something new and great and wonderful. He says, I think we're onto something. I think I've discovered what this value system could be, and he's going forward and describing what that is. And then he says this, more recently we have been learning, especially from physically and mentally sick people, that there are good choosers and bad choosers. We have learned, especially from the psychoanalysts, much about the hidden causes of such behavior and have learned to respect these causes. And he talked earlier about diet and allowing people to choose their own diet, but then he goes on to say, the good choosers in anything, but he's talking specifically about human beings and human beings as they become better people. The good choosers become stronger, larger, more dominant than the poor choosers, which means that they get the best of everything. So he's talking about diet, and then he goes on, that is, good choosers can choose better than bad choosers what is better for the bad choosers themselves. He goes on a little bit later in this chapter and says, and I really enjoy chapter 11. Furthermore, I suspect that what is good for the healthy persons chosen by them may very probably be good for the less healthy people too in the long run, and is what the sick ones would also choose if they could become better choosers. Another way of saying this is that healthy people are better choosers than unhealthy people. I thought that was a fascinating conclusion. And so I love some of the things that he says because he and I aren't the same worldview, and yet we both believe in absolutes. We both believe that there's a right way for healthy people to become healthier, that there's a value system that creates the healthiest, best self-actualized people, and by identifying what makes them healthy. Now, for me and for the Ten Boom Institute, it's the truth shall make you free, right? It's principles. It's true principles that apply to everybody all the time, and I feel like that's a lot what Maslow is saying. The best people in the world that are the healthiest and the happiest are the people that choose best what healthy people ought to choose. And so it really validates many of the things that I believe in. Anyway, Toward a Psychology of Being by Abraham Maslow. Again, I'm going to recommend chapters 1, maybe 4 is pretty good, 5, 6 if you want to read about self-actualized people, 10 about creativity is good, 11 is especially good. So those are the chapters that you could read through if you want to get a taste for a great psychologist. See you next time.